Good morning on this 10th of June, 2021. My name is Chris Roebling, and I'm very proud to be here on behalf of the Hyman Rickover Committee, which is working on the commissioning of the brand new fast attack submarine named for one of the most distinguished Chicagoans in all of history, Hyman Rickover, who achieved the rank of admiral and introduced nuclear power and nuclear propulsion to the United States Navy. As you may know, we've had a series of conversations about naval strategy and the progress of American forces around the world. And today we are very pleased, very proud to welcome back yet another distinguished Chicagoan, and that's Seth Cropsey. Seth Cropsey is going to be speaking with us in a moment, and I'll be introducing him then. We're also going to hear from a representative of the Rickover Commissioning Committee and its activities in general. And that's, of course, Mr. Jeff Kantrowitz. He'll be joining us later on in the program to ask for your support. We also want you to know that the second half of the program really depends on you and on your questions. We've got a Q&A function and we've got a chat function, and we want to hear your questions from you there. Excuse me. And I will pose those, sorry, to Mr. Cropsey when the time comes. So without further ado, I'm sure all of us remember Psalm 107, but just to refresh recollection, the King James Version. They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. They reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man, and they're at wit's end. They cry unto the Lord in their trouble, and he bringeth them out of their distress. Today's speaker, Seth Cropsey, has been crying to the Lord in distress in a series of books and articles and in an extremely impressive corpus of professional work. Most recently, the book Sea Blindness, How Political Neglect is Choking American Sea Power and What to Do About it. That's Mr. Cropsey's 2017 book, which, if you go on Amazon, has got uniformly phenomenal reviews. Congratulations on that, Seth. It's terrific to have you here as part of this series on U.S. sea power and the role that the SSN Hyman Rickover is going to play in that sea power. So we look forward to your comments, and the floor now is yours.
Chris, thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here today and look forward to being called, as usual, a bearer of bad news. But I think it's better to understand what's going on than to look the other way, and looking the other way is what we've done as a nation. The section that you quoted from the King James Version of the Bible, with the analogy to a drunken man in the description of those that go down to the sea in ships, suggests that the author of the Bible a long time ago knew a great deal more than he may have been letting on about his subject. I won't try to pull any punches today. I'd like to start off, though, with what the biblical reference reminded me of, and that is history. Despite his policy of appeasement, Neville Chamberlain was, throughout the years just preceding World War II, a strong advocate of the fighter planes that were decisive in Britain's successful campaign to control the skies in 1940. The Spitfire prototype actually flew for the first time in 1936. And a year later, as Prime Minister, Chamberlain supported the Royal Air Force vigorously. Nevertheless, as you know, the Battle of Britain was won very narrowly. It could have gone the other way. So the pace of warfare today, the years needed to build new ships, to say nothing of repair those that could be damaged in battle, and the tremendous distance of mainland Asia from the United States put deterrence along with the ability to win a conflict at risk, absent properly designed and sufficiently numerous ships. Chamberlain's support for building the UK's fighter force was not, nor was it intended to be, a war-winning strategy. Still, it was a policy that chose to invest in fighters over the bombers that Chief of the Air Staff Hugh Trenchard had favored, a policy that put homeland defense before imperial defense. It was something like a strategy. Other countries have developed far broader strategies, and many successfully. The United States changed its maritime strategy at the end of the Cold War. What had been previously was protecting the US shipping of troops and equipment to Europe in anticipation of or in response to NATO Warsaw Pact confrontation at the Central Front. The change in US maritime strategy changed all of this. The Navy chose a more aggressive approach to the USSR, threatening to destroy the second strike ability of Soviet ballistic missiles in their northern sea bastions, and sailing carriers and escorts into striking range of major military targets in the northern Soviet Union. The object of the former was to degrade the Soviets' ability to respond if a war in Europe escalated into a nuclear one. The aim of the latter was really to sap the Soviet High Command's ability to focus their entire effort on the Central European front. So this change had precedent. The interwar period of today has replaced the post-Cold War period. Interwar is the same name we use in describing the 1920s and the 1930s, when the Navy and Marine Corps understood the possibility of war in the Pacific and the likelihood that Japan would be the enemy. I think many of you probably know about the Naval War College's war games that resulted in War Plan Orange. If not, it's worth at least Googling, and it's worth reading a book on War Plan Orange. It recommended building a large fleet with strong emphasis on submarine and carrier forces and the island hopping campaign, whose goal was to surround, choke, eventually defeat Japan. War Plan Orange was tested at sea by exercises called fleet problems and joint training with the Marine Corps and with the Army, which, as you know, participated substantially in the Pacific campaign. The admirals who led the Navy to victory in the Pacific, Nimitz, King, Halsey, Spruance, were already in positions of responsibility. The peacetime set of admirals didn't need to be replaced. Navy looked ahead, identified the problem, and provided a solution that was key to defeating the Japanese Empire. Similar foresight is largely absent today. Released this past December, that is in 2020, the quote, advantage at sea, unquote, white paper underscores Navy's blue water competence, the Coast Guard's global reach, and the Marine Corps' expeditionary ability to operate within China's anti-access area denial space. The paper acknowledges the importance of cooperation among the U.S. sea services. There's hardly an argument against this. Under Commandant General David Berger, the Marines are moving away from the land war focus of the previous 30 years and toward a lighter, more mobile, more maneuverable and survivable force that can island hop, that can operate with allies and hold choke points within the expanding range of China's A2AD reach. Unmanned systems will play an important role in the Corps' transformation, as will cyber capabilities. There is an implicit strategy in this. The USMC will be ready to defend or retake forward US bases and other strategic assets in the West Pacific, deny China its effort to control such critical choke points as the straits that connect Asia with the Middle East and Europe, and return to its traditional global crisis response mission. The Marine Corps is heading in the right direction. Still, a broad strategy for the sea services that will deter or defeat China remains to be articulated. Questions abound. They're vital because conflict with China is most likely to occur at sea and or in the littorals closest to the sea. What do we expect? Do we expect a short, intense conflict? And if so, do we have forward deployed forces sufficient in number to win? It takes weeks for US forces to move in large groups across the Pacific. Will the US seek to cut China off from its imports, primarily oil, and ability to export? If our forces and bases throughout the West Pacific were saturated by Chinese missiles and land-based aviation, which is within their power, would we risk escalation and attack China's land-based command and control, supply, and missile launchers? What priority do we give to defending our allies? Would we defend Taiwan? And if so, will we sell them the vastly increased arsenal of surface-to-air and surface-to-surface missiles needed to help preserve control of Taiwan's airspace, and also allow them to target amphibious ships that China would surely use to invade Taiwan? There are plenty of useful ideas about defeating China. The US, Australia, India, and Japan form a almost formal, informal strategic partnership called the Quad. Increased naval military exercises, planning, interoperability, greater sharing of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and targeting, and division of operational responsibilities would add sinews to the Quad, would strengthen it. Unlike in Europe, many of whose nations are linked with one another because of history, Asian states, also because of history, are largely disconnected from one another. This so-called hub and spoke system of alliances with the US as the hub is supposed to be sufficient. It isn't. Defeating China in a conflict requires a much greater degree of inter-allied cooperation. US politicians' calls for Westpac states to carry their own weight is bloviation. It's just talking. What's needed is for the states in the region that fear China, in other words, all of them, to dramatically increase their own militaries and their interoperability with one another and with US forces. However, these are all tactical and campaign level measures. The question of strategy remains unanswered and falls to the US, particularly the US Navy. I'd like to get to this in the question period, but there are some points to consider. Good strategies begin with the question, what does the enemy value most? The answer with China is straightforward. The Chinese Communist Party values its own survival above everything. Key to the CCP's survival is China's continued economic growth. A parallel key is returning China to its arguably former position, that is, before European colonization, as a world power, or at least an economic power. China's current rulers seek global hegemony. Cutting China's ability to import raw materials and export finished goods by sea would slice into economic growth and its citizens' toleration of Chinese rulers. One way to accomplish this is to blockade the Southeast Asian straits that connect China to the Middle East and Europe. At the same time, the defense of regional US allies and partners is essential for the US to project power and to deny China its goal of replacing the United States as the preeminent Pacific power, an objective they would achieve by seizing Taiwan and defeating US allies in the first island chain from Japan to the Philippines. Such a victory would also give China unquestioned access to the Central and Eastern Pacific. Hawaii would be vulnerable to surface action groups, as Guam already is. Both islands need far more vigorous defenses than they currently possess. China has more than one class of missile that can reach both islands. US strategy should consist of a shield to protect our partners and allies in the Indo-Pac that includes large numbers of yet unbuilt vessels, both manned and unmanned. These complicate Chinese targeting and can destroy China's ability to use sea and air power to intimidate or defeat our allies. This also includes more advanced cyber capabilities than we now possess and requires a large investment in artificial intelligence, investment in yards that can turn out smaller, more lethal vessels than the fleet currently possesses. It requires more manned submarines complemented by long-endurance autonomous submarines. It means greater allied efforts and may demand escalating to strike key parts of China's land-based defensive capability. The sword that accompanies this shield is the greatly increased ability of current US naval and amphibious forces' ability to control the Southeast Asian and Middle East straits that are critical to China's economy. This also demands a host of unmanned air, surface, and subsurface platforms, in addition to hypersonic missile-bearing ones and defenses against hypersonics in all domains, and in numbers that will discourage China from the most likely source of conflict, an armed attack on Taiwan. Defeat or even a draw in the West Pacific is not acceptable if the United States is to remain the world's preeminent military power. In such an event, our current Indo-Pac allies and partners would start to look to China instead of the US for security and the future health of their economies. Europe would also shift priorities as it became apparent that China was the strong horse with the same deleterious effect on transatlantic security and economic relations. It would simply be a question of time until NATO collapsed. China's large number of high-speed, long-range, and quite probably accurate missiles, combined with its superior numbers of combat ships, and as I mentioned earlier, their geographic advantage, that is being close to the battlefield, battle space, suggests that they seek a quick and decisive victory in any conflict. Most of what we need to prevent this is not built, nor are there even plans or budgets or strategy to do so. You can't get well until you know you're sick. US defense budgets and planning barely recognize China's massive arms buildup, the one that began more than 20 years ago. This is neither healthy nor is it recognized. In retrospective, Neville Chamberlain at least understood part of the problem 3 years before Britain was attacked. I don't see that here. So I thank you again for the opportunity to offer these remarks, and am happy to answer questions. Or I think I'm happy to answer questions.
Seth Cropsey, thank you. Seth Cropsey, thank you very much for those arresting remarks. Now that I can speak again, I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors for this conversation. And I want to encourage everybody to use the Q&A function down in the middle of your screen. If you click on there, you'll be able to send a question and we'll get through those. I think this is obviously very provocative. And obviously, my sense is we've got an audience today, Seth, that understands the significance of your comments. And so I hope we have an in-depth give and take before we hear from our friend Jeff about the very important work of the Hyman Rickover Committee and the other things it's up to. With respect to our co-sponsors today, we want to welcome the Naval Submarine League and recognize their contribution, as well as the Navy League of the United States and its Illinois chapters, the Aurora Council, the Chicago Council of the Navy League, the Glenview Council, and the Lake County Council of the Navy League. The Standard Club joins us today as a co-sponsor, and as always, we warmly welcome them. The United States Naval Institute signed on for today's program. Thank you very much. As did the USS Chicago 721 Club and the USS Illinois 786 Club. We are also very proud to welcome in this ongoing period of Memorial Day and our recollection of the sacrifices made in defense of our liberties and our ability to live life in accordance with our principles, the U.S. Submarine Veterans Incorporated. The big email, or I'm sorry, the big website we want you to visit, ussrickover.org, ussrickover.org. And as I say, Jeff Kantrowitz will be joining us before the end of the hour to chat more about what the Rickover Committee is doing and how you can help out. Our first question, Seth, comes from another veteran of the Reagan administration, another friend of yours and colleague, Joe Morris, who also studied under your dad at the University of Chicago, who asks, how true are today's assertions by PRC that we cannot defend Taiwan.
Cannot defend
Taiwan.
Taiwan. We can defend Taiwan. It requires two things. One is the political will, in other words, the leadership of the United States to explain what the stakes are. And the second is to start acting now to provide Taiwan with the defensive equipment that it's got to have on hand, not waiting 3 weeks or a couple of months for it. For example, long-range surface-to-surface missiles that can, with ranges at least as great as the Harpoon and up to the long-range missile that is now in development and it has been deployed in places, which has a 300-mile range. So they need a lot of those because it would be very helpful. It's necessary to stop Chinese ships, amphibious ships, from reaching the shore. They also need much better missile defenses. They also need encouragement from not only the United States, but other friends and allies, partners in the region like Japan, which is understandably interested in Taiwan's fate, to increase their defense spending to reflect the danger of the Chinese threat. So if we were to take these actions today and start, and I wouldn't stop at these. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other things we could do as well, including set up a command center where that would be staffed by both Taiwanese and U.S. officers, increase contacts between the commander of the Indo-Pacific Command and the Taiwanese, and make it a declaratory policy of the U.S. government that it will defend Taiwan if attacked. So there's a whole range of things that we could do that we're not doing that would make the Chinese think extremely carefully before deciding that they wanted to gamble on that. A gamble on that by Xi Jinping, a gambling on invasion that failed, means Xi Jinping goes away. He doesn't want to go away.
Former president of the Union League Club and naval officer from the Vietnam era, William Nissen, he was a surface ship officer, asks, in your view, is the U.S. mix of naval assets between submarines and surface amphibious combatants, aircraft carriers, the right mix? And I think he's also asking, are we, some of us go back to the Lehman years and the 600 ship Navy, and now we're talking about a 335 ship Navy. A, do we have the right mix? And B, are we headed for the right level of assets?
No and no. We need a lot more than 335 ships, and their design needs to change somewhat. That means two things. One is a far greater use of unmanned vehicles, subsurface, surface, and aerial, much larger than we have right now, and including the composition of the air wing on carriers. And it also means that we need a much larger number. We have very, very few. We need a lot of smaller, highly lethal surface vessels that will complicate China's attacking plans and their defensive ones by simply increasing the number of targets that are out there in the South China Sea or in the peripherals, and that are less expensive, and as I say, increasingly lethal, more lethal. Sending a destroyer in there, we have a very limited number of destroyers in the world, and they're not enough. They're not enough. The ones that are forward deployed and assigned to Westpac are not enough to counter a Chinese attack on our allies, on Taiwan, even in an accident that caused a conflict between the United States and China. So I don't think it's the right mix. We need more submarines. We need more smaller combat and less expensive combat ships, vessels with very little gold plating, if any at all. I'm against gold plating, but a lot of missiles and a major impediment for China's targeting.
Marcus Friedman, picking up on the capital ship design question, points out that carriers and submarines are built at huge sums. Okay, you just said that you're against gold plating. He asks
Everybody
about. Well, wait a minute. On the Appropriations Committee, I know that there were folks who liked gold plate, but we'll skip that.
Everybody in the Navy.
Yeah, there you go. He asks about alternative designs, lower cost, broader implication, and who might be working on such designs? Who might have a sense? Can we look at other navies like India, UK? Are there others out there? And by the way, we've got some terrific questions coming up. Please go ahead. Thanks.
Are people working on, are there institutions working on the kinds of vessels I'm talking about? Sure. And there are a lot out there which members of and former members of the Appropriations Committee would throw up on their shoes about buying, because they're made in other countries like Scandinavia, like Scandinavian countries, which have a large number of smaller vessels, and many of them very good, but politically impractical for the U.S. to buy. This also means that we need the shipyards to turn them out in numbers, and that means planning right now. I don't see that happening. It's easier to work on design than to go to Congress and the White House and say, we need to start making some large capital investments in shipyards, both Navy, and incentives to private shipyards to expand so that they can do all sorts of things, not just build smaller combat craft, but also repair damaged ships. We don't have that capability today. And if there's going to be a protracted war with China, and protracted could mean, in modern contemporary terms, 18 months. What do we do about ships that are damaged and can't fulfill their mission, but could if there were repair facilities locally, or even back on the West Coast of the United States? We don't have them.
Let me continue here. David Whitehurst asks about the tactical role of littoral combat ships. How might we see them in a conflict? What mission might they execute, and what benefit might they bring?
Well, as you may know, the Navy has all but canceled the littoral combat ship. They're pulling back two of the first class of combat ships that were of LCSs that were produced, and they're going to be out of the fleet within a year or so, if not sooner. So the LCS's inability to defend itself from air threats and the failure so far to produce the combat modules that was one of the main justifications for the LCS has produced consequences. And the most important one of them is that the Navy is basically pitching the LCS idea.
Let me tell a bunch of people, Bill Nissen and R.D. Yant and David Hilfers. I'm going to be getting to your questions momentarily, but as long as we're still talking about hardware, David Herbert puts before us this query. In light of the June 4th memo from acting SecNav Thomas Harker, that the Navy must choose between SSN-X and DDG-X, so that would be fast attack submarine experimental and destroyer experimental, and the next gen aircraft program at the Navy. Which program, in your opinion, should be modernized first? And what are the implications of delaying the other two that are not modernized? And
yeah, well, I think submarines come first. They're the most stealthy, hardest to detect, and easily the most lethal. Without detection. So if it's an either or a 1 out of 3 proposition, then I think that submarines make the most sense. On the other hand, it's a choice that we should not make. We may be forced into it, but that's what I was talking about in the speech. And that is, I mean, in the presentation, and that is that the options that face us now, we have 2 options: be prepared or don't be prepared. And the ultimate answer to this question can be found in strategy. And I would not answer it. I mean, I'm giving you an informal answer here. If I were asked to testify before Congress on this, I would duck the question and I would say, well, tell me, Senator so-and-so or Congressman so-and-so, what strategy do you want? What strategy have you asked of the Navy? What is the Navy's strategy? And after you tell me that question, then I can give you an answer to yours about which platforms we ought to emphasize first. But until we know that, we're just kind of throwing darts in a dark room blindfolded, and we don't even know what the target is.
Bill Whitsett is the chairman of the USS Montana SSN 794 committee. And he asks, what, in your opinion, is the most important tactical priority among those that you have mentioned, assuming some near-term steps are going to be necessary as a more complete strategy is articulated?
Well, I hate to sound like a broken record here, but what's the strategy? Is it defensive? Is it offensive? Is it a combination of the two? Are we going to try to succeed with a FAR blockade only? And if we do, where does that leave our allies? And do we see, what do we see in the South China Sea? Are we going to be able to get in there and survive? Do we even want to? Is a fleet action of the kind that the Chinese are preparing for something that we want to get involved with? Or is there another way? Is there a way to turn their plans against them? I'm not trying to duck the question. It's just that the tactical and programmatic questions must take a subordinate position to the strategic ones. What are we doing? What are our war aims? How do we plan to defeat China and protect our allies and partners in the Indo-Pac region? And then answer that question. And when you have answers to that questions, then we can start to say, what does fleet architecture look like? Where do we place priorities? What are the most important platforms in doing so? So I'll leave it at that.
Now to the questions about the political and diplomatic context within which we're hammering out, hopefully, a new naval and indeed military and national strategy. Richard Yant asks about a trans-Pacific partnership impacting our relationship with the region, with China, et cetera, and gets us into the question of diplomacy and commercial relations. We've got several more questions on that. But could you please address sort of, folks are certainly aware of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that did not succeed and then different initiatives since then. How might our commercial relationships in the region impact the hammering out of our new naval strategy?
Well, anything that makes us richer should give us greater ability to increase the defense budget as it needs to be increased. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was an excellent idea. It would have been in the economic, diplomatic, and security interest of the United States, no matter how you look at it. I was sorry that the previous administration decided against it, and I hope that it's not too late to resurrect something like it. I would expect that the Biden administration would be very interested in that. I haven't seen a lot of signs that they are, but it's an excellent idea, and it's extremely important to. I don't want to leave the impression that I think the only strategy worth discussing, that strategy is only a question of military strategy. I don't believe that at all. I think that that our diplomatic relations, our economic relationships, our financial ones, across the board, play an extremely important role in keeping our allies and partners close, in providing them with more secure economies, in weaning them away from dependence on trading with China. That is an essential part of a successful U.S. strategy in the Indo-Pacific that I did not address, but it is essential.
And within those commercial relations, there is a considerable amount of U.S. dependence on China for manufacturing and for, relatively speaking, cheap goods. And we're in, those of us who are involved in Chinese commercial relations are well aware of their interest in, say, not just gaining access to American products for China or for what they refer to as Greater China, but also their almost immediate insistence after that on access to American products for sale and distribution in the BRI countries, which they're now referring to, which we know is the Belt and Road Initiative. So they're not just interested in manufacturing in China, they want manufacturing ex-China. They're very devoted to a commercially hegemonic approach that expands their influence from what we would refer to as mainland China, to a greater swath. Okay. So Jeffrey Sachs then says, it seems that we, the US and China, would both suffer enormously from an embargo or from a blockade. Is it possible to have some kind of militarily effective action without starting a shooting war?
I don't know. But history is replete with warnings that that blockades and economic actions and sanctions and so forth would have adverse consequences, and it's often correct. Um, the English member of Parliament who wrote a pamphlet in, I don't know, around 1900, in 1911 or so, that said that there was so much economic interconnectedness between Germany and England that war was unthinkable and impossible. Had the misfortune to have his essay republished as a book that came out in August of 1914. So I think that economic conflict between the United States and China would have adverse impact. But does that mean that we should rule out a blockade of China in a conflict? I don't see that at all. Yes, was England affected by the blockade that it instituted on the continent during the Napoleonic Wars? Of course. But the English object was to remove Napoleon as a danger to the continent and to England. That took priority. It usually does.
David Hilver's now transitioning from the commercial into the political and the domestic political, asks if there is any Venn diagram that shows, here's a circle on one side of our aisle, so to speak, and here's a circle on the other side. Do you see any overlap such that our China policy, and indeed its undergirding strategy, actually has vital support from both sides of that aisle?
You mean politically?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's one of the issues that both parties are fairly close to one another on. I think there's a general sense in Congress that there has been no accounting for whatever responsibility China may have had in COVID. And I think there's a growing understanding, not only in Congress, but in the country as well, that even Chinese products that are not defective may not be the ones you want to purchase first if you have an option. My wife said, after going shopping for something or other the other day, she said, I asked the proprietor of the store, is this made in China? He said, because if it is, I'm not buying it. I don't think she's alone in her feeling. I've heard other people say the same thing. My wife is not the only one. But I think that that sentiment crosses party lines. And I think that with effective leadership, which is to say leadership that acts as well as speaks, that that's an important element in the defense budget, for example, in convincing China that we're serious about their misbehavior, in gathering support among the citizenry for, among among American citizens for a tougher policy toward China. You know, for from even before the Reagan administration, from the Carter administration until the Trump administration, and I mean to make no political favorable or unfavorable comments about any administration here, but it is a fact that for well over 40 years, US policy toward China was based on the hope that including China in world organizations, including China in US military exercises in the Pacific, welcoming China to be a part of organizations like the World Health Organization, granting them most favored nation status, and so on, would make China a stakeholder in the so-called liberal international order. It's only in the last administration that a defense secretary, Jim Mattis, and the administration, with the administration's support, said China is so no sign, no interest at all of protecting the liberal international order. Quite the opposite. It seeks to disrupt it. And that took 40 years to come to that conclusion. So I guess what I'm saying is act on it. If that's correct, then our actions and our policy ought to reflect that. And we're slow coming out of the chute on that.
Okay. Frederick Crawford then begins to expand, now that we're back on the strategic side or the geostrategic side, about Chinese and Russian cooperation. Should we anticipate a second front in a sea conflict emanating, I'm just saying, Vladivostok? So is the Chinese Navy one issue that will then have an echo coming from the Russian Navy?
Well, I think it would be unwise to assume that the other countries that view us as an adversary will sit on their hands if there's a conflict between the United States and China. I think it would simply be a mistake to say, oh yeah, Russia's just going to sit it out and do nothing. Iran will not take actions in the Middle East. North Korea will not be at least using its considerable cyber capabilities to attack US targets. I think the reasonable thing to assume is that America's adversaries will move if there's a conflict between the United States and China, and we ought to be prepared for it. We ought to expect it.
Robert Whittabort notes that in Admiral Stavridis's 2034, the nuclear threshold gets crossed early in a US-China conflict. Now, what is your sense of where China might place that threshold tactically in the case of a sea conflict, or strategically in case of a sort of a global dispute? I also want to point out that Commander Whittabort is a retired Navy commander. Mm-hmm. We appreciate his question.
Yeah. So I think that the Chinese threshold for nuclear escalation is serious, and it's relatively low. And that's a very important reason for making it clear to them that they will lose a conventional conflict with the United States. that it's a powerful deterrent to escalation to the nuclear level, to have the forces in place, effective forces in place and in the right number, and a strategy that governs them, that tells China, now you really don't want to do this because you're going to lose. And the more likely a conflict, a conventional conflict is, the more likely it is that measures that I talked about a few minutes ago, such as targeting their command and control, shore-based facilities and supply and logistics and launchers for their huge number of missiles, the more likely it is that we are not ready, that's one of our only recourses, the more likely it is that that we're facing the prospect of nuclear escalation. We shouldn't get there. We should make it clear that that we would win a conflict, that we are committed to the defense of Taiwan and Japan and the Philippines and if necessary Vietnam. So I think we need to do that and take the nuclear escalation possibilities off the table as much as we possibly can.
Thank you so much. We've got our presentation about the Rickover committee, Seth, and our Mark Kantrowitz is going to do that, but he also submitted a question. So to get on to Mark's part of the program, I want to give you his question and then we'll bring him in. He wants to hear more of your thoughts about unmanned, autonomous, robotic submarines, which I think all of us understand a lot's going on in that field. We talked about this with the immediate past CNO, Admiral Richardson, a few weeks ago. Are those emerging as a low cost and perhaps highly effective complication for those who would challenge the international order in the sea lanes of communication?
Well, that's the objective, certainly the objective. It's not, the plan is not to be spending $2 billion apiece on unmanned submersibles. Well, that's what a Virginia class sub costs. So the idea is to drive down the price and drive up the numbers, and don't do that by coming out with the same cost point that you do for an SSN. So that's what people want. It should be possible. The advantages of unmanned submersibles is extraordinary. I mean, it goes from intelligence gathering, surveillance, reconnaissance, including targeting, projecting power, using force, deploying torpedoes, perhaps at some point, even shorter range missiles. I mean, there's just a lot there. And if we're willing to pay what would certainly be the higher price for a submersible that's powered by nuclear power, would have endurance. It would have an endurance that would be extraordinary in a conflict in anywhere from the first island chain deep into the Indian Ocean. So you're right. There's a lot of work that's being done there. It's a big step that the submarine community took in accepting the idea of diesel or diesel electric or electric battery-powered submarines as opposed to nuclear-powered ones. I think we ought to be thinking about nuclear-powered ones as well. But I haven't seen the cost numbers on that. It would be high. But it's a smaller plant, so it would be less expensive. But the endurance abilities there would give us an exceptional strategic advantage.
Well, I can say, calling on our mutual Washington experience, that the cost of the Rickover Committee is basically 3 hammers and 2 toilet seats compared to the cost of the Rickover. And to help us find our way through our funding of those costs, we welcome now onto the program Mark Kantrowitz. Mark, thank you so much for that question, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. The USS Hyman G. Rickover, SSN 795, is a new nuclear submarine that will defend our nation and honor the legacy of Admiral Rickover. The commissioning committee provides civilian support for the Rickover and her crew. I ask you to join the commissioning committee in supporting the Rickover by making a tax-deductible donation. Patriotic donors are needed for 3 main reasons. The commissioning ceremony for a Navy ship is a long-standing and revered tradition that promotes patriotism among those who attend and shows the crew of the newly commissioned vessel that the public appreciates the great sacrifices they make to defend our nation. A commissioning ceremony is costly, and Congress provides only very limited funds for basics such as bunting, attendee stands, and bus transportation from a local hotel to the ceremony. To give the crew and public a proper ceremony, our committee must raise funds and organize the ceremony and the accompanying celebrations. Donated funds are also used to buy items for the crew that are not supplied by the Navy, including amenities that make life easier for the crew as they spend many months at sea in very close quarters away from their homes and families in defense of our nation. Funds are also used for plaques and other memorabilia that honor the crew for being the plank owners, which are the first personnel to man a ship. The commissioning ceremony and the accompanying activities will also honor Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, an American success story who continues to inspire new generations. As a young boy, he and his family immigrated to the United States and settled in Chicago from present-day Poland to escape anti-Jewish pogroms in what was then the Russian Empire. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1922. He was the driving force behind the development of the first nuclear submarine in 1955, and he became the father of the nuclear Navy. He revolutionized Navy ship propulsion, quality control, personnel selection, and training and education to build the nation's nuclear fleet. I met the Admiral in 1984 when I attended the Rickover Science Institute. Please join our committee in supporting our national defense and those who provide that defense by donating to our committee's work. You can donate with PayPal or a credit or debit card on our website, ussrickover.org. You can also make a donation from your IRA by asking your IRA custodian to make a direct transfer to USS Hyman G. Rickover Commissioning Committee, 65 West Jackson Boulevard, Chicago, Illinois, 60605. The committee is a division of the Armed Forces Council of Chicago, which is a tax-exempt 501c3 organization. Your donation is deductible to the extent permitted by law. The committee's tax ID number is 36-3100750. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for those words, and thank you, Seth Cropsey, for joining us today and for contributing your insights on the importance of a vital and vibrant United States Navy, of which the new Hyman Rickover will be one part. It's a real privilege to welcome the Naval Submarine League, the Navy League of the United States and its Illinois chapters in Aurora, in Glenview, Lake County, and Chicago, the Standard Club, the United States Naval Institute, the USS Chicago 721 Club, the USS Illinois 786 Club, and the U.S. Submarine Veterans Incorporated. Thank you, one. Thank you all, and thanks to all who have joined us for this program. We look forward to seeing you again, and we will stay in touch. So until then, have a lovely afternoon.